What a great pleasure it is to be here today. I kind of think the kingdom of God is about to descend upon us for a number of reasons. I was here for 11 years as the pastor of Tabernacle Church across the river. And this is the first time I've preached in this pulpit. So I've crossed the River Jordan to come here. And secondly, I was invited by a graduate of Harvard Divinity School and Princeton Theological Seminaries to be here, and I'm a graduate of another seminary yet, Union Theological Seminary in New York, and I serve yet another seminary, San Francisco Theological Seminary. I think ecumenism and interfaith dialogue is bursting out all over. And that's really what is actually happening today in the church. I'm being a little facetious about my being here, but I'm not being facetious about what's happening in the church and what's actually happening in seminaries. I want to tell you just briefly about SFTS. That's what we call it out there, probably because we're not in San Francisco, we're in San Anselmo, north of San Francisco, but we are in the Bay. It's a beautiful part of the world. But seminaries, in fact, whether you're at Princeton Seminary or Harvard Divinity School or Vanderbilt or University of Chicago or Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, name a seminary of any denomination. And I dare say that every seminary is going through huge changes to respond to a changing church, which is trying to respond to a changing world. I have had the privilege over the last 2+ years as president of getting to meet more than 100 different seminary presidents. And it feels like we are, in fact, part of God's work in the world, doing something together, not in competition, but in rather seeking to be something of a seed, which is what the word seminary comes from, the idea of seminal, to be a seed for the church. And in San Francisco Theological Seminary, we are trying to build a new kind of seminary for the 21st century. But we're not alone. We're looking at our curriculum. Every seminary is looking at their curriculum. How can we teach the classic core subjects of biblical study and church history and theology and ethics, but also to infuse that with the practice of ministry. The practice of ministry is everything from how do you run a meeting like a session meeting, to how do you look at a balanced a budget and a balance sheet, but also how do you engage people in spiritual direction. These are all part and parcel of ministry. How do you engage a congregation in community ministry? How do you bring together people who do not agree with one another to learn from each other and to be a part of God's work in the world? That's the task of ministry. And I dare say that any of us who have been in seminary more than 10 years ago went to a different kind of seminary. And so at San Francisco, we're in the process of making those adjustments to be a new kind of seminary for the 21st century. We want to train Christian leaders, yes, pastors, yes, but people who are interested in ministry in many places, not only in congregations or in congregational ministry, but in community ministries, in innovative ministries. This is the task we face, and we face it together. And so actually we just established something called the Center for Innovation in Ministry. And I'm going to tell you who, we just hired somebody from Philadelphia to help us figure it out. Sherry Hauser. Now, if you've been involved with the Interfaith Network here in Philadelphia, you know who the Reverend Sherry Hauser is. She's a part of this, she was at Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church. But she was part of the founding group of clergy from across different denominations and faiths who came together to start that very important ministry here in Philadelphia. There's lots of interesting things going on in the church these days, and seminaries need to interact and be connected to them, to learn from them, but also to help spread the word, to bring people together. So we consider this Center for Innovation in Ministry a kind of hub. People coming in and going out, hearing, listening, thinking together, what works, what doesn't work, what works in this context but not in that context. That's what seminaries are trying to do. Yes, we need grounding in biblical studies, but we also need a kind of spiritual formation in our leaders, whether they're ordained or not in the church, and whether they're ordained to professional ministry or whether they're ordained to ruling elder ministries, to be able to carry out that ministry with a sense of energy and a sense of God's purpose leading them and God's Spirit at work in the world. And so I thought about how to express that, and the parable of the sower seems apt. And I'd like for you to consider this with me. Listen, said Jesus, a sower went out to sow. Such a simple statement. A doctor went out to heal. A minister went out to minister. A carpenter went out to build. Doing what we were given to do, the gifts of God. A sower went out to sow. But the image of sowing seeds is a very powerful image. Sowing seeds is about life. It's about change. It's about generativity. It's about empowerment. It's about faith and hope. It's about the future. Whenever we sow in expectation, but also without certainty. The results of sowing are not a given. That's what the parable tells us. But in the very act of sowing, of casting seeds upon the earth, there is a quickening of the heart. And so the story begins. A sower went out to sow. This simple but powerful parable has much to tell us about what I've called the calculus of innovation, and especially innovation in ministry. And for all of us who are stewards of God's church, there are lessons here for sure. But to get to the point, you've got to put out of your mind the image of modern agriculture. This is not about row upon row of corn or soy or wheat that has been planted with a tractor. In fact, you've got to get rid of the image of rows of anything, really, whether planted by hand or planted by machine. That's way too orderly. That's way too mechanical. Instead, put in your mind the image of an SFTS student, Patrick Diptum, his grandmother in Kenya. When it came time to plant seeds, Patrick's grandmother followed a time-honored traditional method. She would take her seed bag and, slung over her shoulder, walk out into her small plot of land and grab a fistful of seed out of that bag and scatter it willy-nilly, as if feeding chickens or throwing dice. That's the image you have to have in mind when you hear and read this parable. Nowadays in Kenya, Patrick's grandmother's way of planting has been superseded by methods of sowing that increase yields even for subsistence farmers. But to understand the parable and its lessons for us today, keep this in mind. Patrick's grandmother, sowing seeds. Seeds strewn. Seeds no longer in one's possession, but released from one's hands, landing on the ground where they await an uncertain future, filled with both promise and peril, subject now to elements beyond the sower's control. This is the act of sowing. So what can we learn about this from this parable? Well, first, this parable is about calculus. It's a subject I'm sure you're all familiar with. Calculus is the mathematical study of change. The parable shows us that mathematically, change occurs only through a tiny fraction of our efforts. Many of the seeds that were sown by this sower never germinated, never bore fruit. They were eaten by the birds, choked by the weeds, dried out by the sun. The seeds themselves are fine, but they landed in inhospitable, unreceptive environments. The calculus of innovation tells us that there is a lot of stuff that doesn't turn out the way that we had hoped or planned. Every new ministry initiative faces the same calculus. The ideas may be good, but the receptivity is just not there. There are always ideas whose time has not yet come, or whose time has come and went, come and gone. Timing is sometimes the key variable in determining the success of germinating seeds that we might want to sow. But another important variable in the calculus equation is the intended audience, the soil, if you will, where we sow. Sometimes people are just not ready to say yes. And as any fundraiser will tell you, hearing the word no in response to a request for funds rarely means never. It may mean not now, or not for this purpose or that project. It may mean not that amount. But rarely, if ever, does no mean not now or in the future under any circumstance. A lot of seed gets wasted in the process of sowing. Between the birds and the weeds and the sun, much of the sower's efforts are come to naught. That's how it is with innovation. There's a lot of effort that never bears fruit. Yes, in the calculus of sowing seeds, failure is inevitable. It is part of the dynamic of innovation. Any innovator will tell you that. But the experience of failure should not deter us from the task of innovating, nor should the fear of failure keep us from trying to do something that we've never done before. Our failures can tell us a lot about how to improve our initiatives. We can learn from our failures, or shall we say, from a low yield or a rate of return that is low in response to our efforts. For example, today in Africa, very few farmers use the method of sowing favored by Patrick's grandmother. Now farmers have cell phones, and they have access to hybrid seeds. They're learning the importance of land preparation and what kind of land is best for planting. And now they space their seeds using planting strings attached to 2 sticks and marked so that there are 10 inches, 25 centimeters, between each seed in a row, and 2.5 feet between each row, 75 centimeters. And just one seed at a time is placed in each hole, covering with a little bit of dirt and fertilizer. And they use drip irrigation so less water evaporates. And now their yields are double and triple what they were just a generation ago. Innovation. Yet even with these agricultural innovations in Africa, farmers are still subject to blight and flooding and drought. Their lives are improved, but they are far from easy. They need innovation, and they need for innovation to continue. The calculus remains largely the same. The parable of the sower tells us that for every possibility of a seed that germinating and bearing fruit, there are 3 other possibilities for a different kind of future. But the parable also tells us that when innovation meets a receptive audience at the right time, the fruit of those efforts more than makes up for all the seeds that never germinated and were never productive. So yes, randomly speaking, 3 out of 4 seeds never sprout. But in the 1 in 4 that does, it produces 30, 60, 100-fold. Amazing and true. Think about it. Let me tell you the story about Wangari Maathai. And as I do, I want you to make a note of every time that you hear or see someone in her life sowing a seed. Wangari was born in 1940 in Kenya, Nyeri, in the foothills around Mount Kenya. As a young girl, Wangari was taught to respect nature. She grew up loving the land, plants, and animals that surrounded her, from the giant mugumu trees that her people, the Kikuyu, revered, to the tiny tadpoles that swam in the river. Most Kenyan girls were not allowed to go to school. But when Wangari was growing up, she was one of the fortunate ones. Given the opportunity, her mind sprouted like a seed, and she became a star student, excelling at science. She won a scholarship to study biology at Mount St. Scholastica College in Atchison, Kansas, receiving her bachelor's degree in 1964 at age 24. Then she earned a Master of Science degree from the University of Pittsburgh. She returned to Kenya and earned a doctorate in veterinary anatomy at the University of Nairobi, becoming the first woman in East or Central Africa to hold such a degree. She then taught at the university as an associate professor and was the chairwoman of its veterinary anatomy department in the 1970s. It was at that time that Wangari began to use her knowledge and her compassion to promote the rights of women and the preservation of the environment in her country. In the mid-1970s, she began a movement to reforest her country by paying poor women a few shillings to plant trees. In 1977, she founded the Green Belt Movement, whose mission was to plant trees across Kenya to fight erosion and to create firewood for fuel and jobs for women. Over the next 35 years, before she died at the age of 71 in 2011, her organization planted more than 30 million trees across Africa, helped nearly 1 million women, and inspired similar efforts in other African countries. Wangari Maathai was the first African woman and the first environmentalist to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. Her story is the story of many sowers, herself included, sowing many seeds, literally and figuratively. Of course, what you didn't hear were all of the failures, all of the setbacks, all of the moments of discouragement, opposition, and resistance, and believe me, they were there. Those too are a part of Wangari's story. Not every seed that was planted blossomed and flourished. Jesus told the parable of the sower to demonstrate how God works with human effort to achieve God's purposes and to bring about surprising, wonderful, praiseworthy things in women and men and in human history. It's a parable we should take to heart as we live into our future as God's people, trying to live our lives of faith in the 21st century. Thanks be to God.